afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another video lecture. So today we are going to be talking about the final exam a little bit more in detail. And at the end of the video, I'll also post the FAQs to the discussion board forum that was in relation to the rhetorical analysis essay, so you can check those out there if you didn't get a chance to see my responses to some of the other students' frequently asked questions for your last essay. So today's video, again, I'm going to be going through some final exam preparation. I just received the final exam practice, so I'll provide that for you all as well. That'll be kind of paired with this video. And I want to run through some of the questions that you can expect to see, the style that you'll be expected to answer those questions in. So let's get started. Okay, so first, super important piece of information. This is the book that you'll need for the final exam. It's the English 103 manual. We don't use it super often throughout the semester. If we were in class, we would use it more, but because of everything switched over to online, we didn't have that opportunity. But all of your final exam readings are in this manual, and you have to have this manual in order to be eligible to pass the exam. And I mentioned this a few videos ago when I was beginning to introduce what you could expect for the final exam. But the main reason is because all of your final exam readings are in this manual, and that's what all of your questions are based on. And so what you'll notice when you open up the final for the final exam readings, they will technically start on page 79, and you'll see up at the top it says final exam information and readings. So that's where you'll want to turn to. This also, I just wanted to preface too, when you're reading the overview for this, this is not what the current overview for the final exam is going to be. Originally, when we meet in person before all of this online class switchover happened, you would meet in a very big lecture hall, and all of the English 103 students at the same time take the final. And originally you would be tasked to write about, I think it's a 4 to 6 handwritten essay. So that's one piece of good news, is you aren't doing that now that we switched to the digital platform. So you'll notice if you do read this overview, it mentions something about writing an essay with a word count. Ignore that. That is not what we're doing. So what is still relevant is this section here where it says readings and critical essays. All of these readings will be the same, and you'll be responsible for knowing these readings kind of inside and out. So my very first suggestion would be grab your manuals and just start reading through all of the essays in the final exam reading section, taking notes and annotating, paying attention to sources that are being used, and just in general what the readings are about. You'll notice that all of these readings have to do with technology in the classroom. So you'll want to make sure you understand what each of these readings is analyzing, not just technology in the classroom, but which sides they're arguing from, what points they're making, and why those are so critical. So for question 1, or grouping 1, we are asking you, how well do you understand sources and source use? So you'll be expected to understand the difference of paraphrasing, summarizing, and quoting. So not just the definition answers and parsing those out. That'll be important and helpful to understand, but we're also looking for you to be able to see something that is paraphrased and say that's a paraphrase, or versus seeing something that is summarized from a given article and being able to say, okay, this is a summary of that article, whereas this is a paraphrasing of a particular portion of it versus this is a direct quote. So for the first question, you really want to be able to parse those differences out and identify them quickly. You should also expect to see something about MLA citation formatting and three-step source integration usage. So I would highly suggest review how to properly integrate an MLA 8 quote using the three-step source integration process. So just to give you guys a quick review crash course on three-step source integration, you want to introduce or provide context for that quote that you are integrating. So that could be something very brief by explaining to the outside reader where this piece is coming from, whether it's a journal or an Instagram post, who the author is, or simply providing a very, very brief summary on the context of the quote itself or the piece of information. So step 2 is dropping or actually integrating the quote. You want to make sure you're using direct quotation marks if it is a direct quote. If you're paraphrasing, that's fine. You still need to cite. So after you have either dropped the direct quote or paraphrased, then you always want to have that followed with an in-text citation. So that's our 2 parentheses that you want to first check to see if you have an author. If you do, you'll use their last name, and if there is a page number, then you would use that as well. If not, revisit my MLA YouTube video lecture on the scaffolding process for how to look for information for in-text citations. And then lastly, your third step for source integration is going to be analyzing or kind of like closing out that quote. So remember, you don't want to just leave the quote hanging. We're interested in seeing the student's analysis of the importance the quote is providing for the essay or the piece. So again, providing some kind of recap or analysis, some kind of evaluation for that. So review MLA, 3-step source integration process. You will probably see some question that is asking you to write a direct quote in proper MLA 8 formatting. So next is more information and more questions about source and source evaluation. So you want to make sure you have brushed up and are super familiar and comfortable with the different types of sources. So primary sources, popular sources, and secondary scholarly sources. Review those terms. Just make sure you understand what they mean. I would highly, highly suggest that you could be able to identify what that type of source is just from looking at a works cited entry. Hint, hint. So there is a little bit of rhetoric involved in the final exam from what I've seen on the practice test and the test itself. We are asking you to be able to identify this idea of audience, which I'm hoping this comes second nature to you all now, because especially in my course, we did the rhetorical analysis, or we're in the process of doing it, and we've talked so much, whether it's in the classroom or virtually, digitally, about what audience means, not just in the context of the rhetorical triangle, but in the grander scheme of things, why audience matters so much. So you can definitely expect to see some kind of question asking you to look at a given reading in the English 103 manual and identify and analyze what that author or who that author is trying to appeal to. So that's a rhetoric term, right? You want to think about, how do you know what the author is trying to convey and who they are trying to maybe persuade, and why is that significant? So I would suggest going through all of your final exam readings and just make a little note on the margin of who that particular audience may be. I feel highly confident in all of you that after reading the final exam readings, that should be relatively easy to determine. So thinking about demographics, populations, audience members, all things that we've talked about throughout the semester, brush up on that as well. So next is information about summaries. This is a pretty straightforward question. If you do receive this question on the final exam, it's not too difficult. I'm hoping it won't give you all any trouble, but you may see a question that asks you to simply write a summary on a given reading, whatever that reading may be. It could be a random one picked from the final exam readings, and you'll have your manuals with you, you'll have your notes with you, so just be able to write a summary, go through, review what a good summary should include, what it should not include, and just be prepared to know the readings very quickly. And that would be my number one tip as well. Do not wait until you are taking the final exam to start reading the readings, because that will be a recipe for disaster. You want to have these readings well prepared and read ahead of time, have notes, annotations, highlights, underlines. You can write and do whatever you want in the book, but know the readings before you start the final exam. It will make this so much easier. And lastly, my study tip for the final exam would to also be able to understand how to analyze source use in the final exam readings. And so all that's referring to is if you see that one of the readings, one of the authors cited an outside source or used a quotation from somebody else, be able to explain or analyze or evaluate what that source, that outside source, was doing or maybe not doing for that particular author's article. So really just refreshing yourselves on credibility aspects, thinking about, did the author integrate the source well? As an outside reader, were you able to tell where the source was coming from? Did it seem helpful, or did it seem to contradict, or did it seem to appeal to you as an audience member? So I would just suggest going through the readings again, and if you see some outside quotes, maybe circle them, highlight them, and just bring your attention to the fact that that author was using an outside source. And if you get that question on the final exam about, was it credible in this particular article when the author used X quote or something like that, that you just have an idea of what they were trying to do with the quote and if it was helpful or not and why.
4, 3, 2, 1. Level up, 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 level up. Oh, this on me so yummy. Oh, this sauce so yummy. No, you want this yummy. Yummy all in your tummy. Level up, 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 level up. Oh, this on me so yummy. Oh, this sauce so yummy. No, you want this yummy. Yummy all in your tummy. Them more mistakes are gone. I won't do them no more. That's old news. That's new news. I done did that before. I turn nothing to something. My comeback